Welcome to Master of Science with host Professor James McCanney. The good professor's career spans 50 years as a university teacher, scientist, and engineer. Each week, he will explore the rapidly changing world of science as many long-held theories are crumbling under the weight of new data. He will cover the fields of geology, archaeology, meteorology, oceanography, space science, astronomy, cosmology, biological evolution, virology, energy, mathematics, and more. So please welcome the host of Master of Science, James McCanney.
Okay, so this week I'm going to continue from the show last week, and I'm going to do a little playing of devil's advocate. Now, we're given this scenario, which is repeated like a Mother Goose nursery rhyme, that the universe began 13 billion years ago in a big bang and everything evolved automatically from that, including you driving your SUV up and down the road, you as a human being, biological species, everything just fell out like Johnny B. Good. So not a problem, except there's a lot of problems. In fact, the scenario is so lame that it's just really hard to imagine that anybody in the scientific world believes this, let alone pawns it off on somebody else. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go through the standard scenarios of supposedly how the solar system formed, show you all the major flaws. I mean, there's so many, it would take hours and hours and hours to point them out. But the crux of the issue also is that in the early 1990s, I was teaching astronomy at the university level in a classroom using textbooks. I've talked about this before. And the textbooks up to today have not changed at all. So this is decades ago, and nothing has changed. There's been no new concepts. It's all the same. And how could that possibly be in a subject that has had all of this new equipment? The Hubble Space Telescope was just coming online when I was teaching university level astronomy and starting to produce data, etc. The James Webb Telescope was not even on the design boards yet. And then what I'm going to do in the second half of this show is I'm going to show you what actually is going on. So what you're going to see is that instead of this dormant solar system that supposedly formed 4.5 billion years ago and nothing has happened since, the solar system is very dynamic with constant change going on. And no, believe me, it's not because an asteroid hit it. There again, I see this constantly. People send me emails, oh, look at what this guy is saying, or that clown over there. And, you know, the main attribute that people point to is, oh, something must have hit Earth. It's a really rudimentary argument that has no validity. And then when it doesn't work, this is what's comical, that when one asteroid doesn't do it, well, maybe 100 asteroids hit Earth. Oh, 100. Why not 1,000? Why not 10,000? The problem with the whole asteroid scenario is it would leave a crater. And something as recent as, say, 10,000 years ago would really leave a crater. And something that was big enough to affect all of Earth. You know, I mean, the trademark of that asteroid hitting Earth would be there, let alone 100 of them. I mean, it's so bizarre. It is so bizarre. But by the way, this is what you call controlled opposition. It's controlled, and then that allows the good guy white hats to come riding in, save the day, and say, look at how lame that science is when those amateurs over there. But then NASA claims it has the good science because they have all the good equipment. but out of both sides, you're getting total misinformation. Okay, so let's pretend, I'm just going to go through the scenario of the standard story of how the solar system formed. Now, by the way, this scenario was originally conceived of in around the 1700s. Laplace, Lagrange, some of these people, these early mathematicians, were trying to figure out, well, how could planets form in these nice circular orbits? Because by that time, they understood that the sun was the center of the solar system. The planets went around in near circular orbits. But they understood, too, that the orbits of the planets were not they were somewhat in a plane, but not a perfect plane. And so they chose, by default, it's kind of like when you count to 10 in the base 10 number system. You have 10 fingers, 10 toes, and pretty much you could use any base. If we had 4 fingers and 4 toes, we'd probably be working in a base 8 number system. But because of the number of fingers and toes we have, we're using a base 10 number system. And so it's similar in astronomy. So the idea that the planets all formed in this nice, neat plane, just, we'll see where that goes. But there are little things too, there are subtleties. And there again, astronomers, I'll just repeat this, it's important to understand. Geologists, astronomers, meteorologists, I could go through the whole laundry list of specialties in science. Very few, if any, have a physics background. Now, why is that important? Because in physics, you understand reality. In astronomy, there's very little reality, because they don't understand physical principles. So if you have a solar system in which, for example, Earth's orbit is not in the same plane as Jupiter's orbit, and so what happens when Earth is above the plane of Jupiter's orbit, guess what? Jupiter's pulling down on Earth to pull it back into the orbital plane of Jupiter. When Earth is below the orbital plane of Jupiter, Jupiter's pulling up. And so it's constantly working to pull Earth into the plane of Jupiter's orbit, and Jupiter's much bigger. And so it's doing that for all the planets. Take little Mercury near the sun. Its orbit is at an angle with the ecliptic plane, or, by the way, if you were an alien coming into the solar system and looked at it for the first time, you would not choose Earth's orbit as the plane of reference for everything else. The reason we do is because that is our perspective. And this was my reference to the 10 fingers and 10 toes in the base 10 number system, is because we live on Earth, so that's kind of our point of reference. That's our first point of reference for understanding the positions of everything else in the solar system. But if you were really to be objective, you would take an average of all the different planets and make that the plane of the planets, because eventually, if all of them worked over a long enough period of time, they would all work into that single orbit. And so just the fact that the members of the solar system are not all lying in the same plane tells us that something else is going on. The whole idea, because back in the days, the Lagrange, Laplacian days, when they were talking about how could this solar system form, and they said, well, it must have been like a big dust cloud that formed and it started rotating, and the planets coalesced out of that, leaving them in this nice plane of the planets. But when you look at it, that story does not add up. It's full of holes. And the biggest one is as follows. Imagine you have a rotating plane of dust and gas, and this supposedly the proto-sun, the pre-sun sun, was forming in the middle and eventually began to glow because of gravitational pressure and kicking off the fusion reaction, supposedly. By the way, that doesn't work, because the fusion of the sun is actually up in the surface, in the atmosphere of the sun, and that was proven conclusively when I was working with Russian scientists in the mid-1990s. They did a very interesting experiment with X-rays showing that the fusion of the sun is up in the atmosphere, another one of the follies of modern astronomical theory and astrophysics theory. But okay, so imagine this dust cloud. It's spinning and rotating. Now in gravity, the farther you are away from the central gravitational source, which in our solar system would be the sun, the farther away you are in an orbit, the slower you go. Okay, so this dust cloud is not a solid disk like a record disk or a CD disk spinning around. It's not a solid disk. And so the stuff that's farther out moves slower. That means if it was going to coalesce as this material moved around and the material farther out was moving slower, then guess what? The rotation of the planets would be backwards of what we see today, because the planets all rotate forward. And the coalescing dust cloud would cause them to spin backwards. Now, realizing this, the astronomers go, oh, okay, well, how do you cure that problem? Because the 9 known planets at that time would have been, they did not know about Pluto, and they did not know about Uranus and Neptune, really, when this idea came about back in the 1700s. It's before Uranus and Neptune were even discovered. So they only had the planets out till Saturn. And so to understand, to come up with an excuse for why all the planets spin backwards of what they should, according to this model, they said, oh, an asteroid hit. So an asteroid had to hit every planet just right to make it turn backwards. But the only problem is, if an asteroid hits a planet, it's not going to reverse its orbit. It's just going to knock a piece of it off, but it's not going to reverse the direction of rotation. But there are some other bigger problems. In fact, these are probably the biggest in terms of the geology of the Earth. When supposedly this material coalesced under gravitational force, and all of this material is colliding with other material and pieces are getting bigger, and supposedly this coalesces. And by the way, nobody has ever witnessed this, either in our solar system or any other solar system, star system. But there are disks around other star systems, but what they're seeing are plasma discharge comets forming planets. And you can see them. I mean, they're very visible. They're comets forming planets. But anyway, back to the original idea, this Laplacian just a dust cloud that's swirling and supposedly forming planets. The heat of formation is very great. And so there are no volatiles, including water. So when your planet gets done forming, it's spinning backwards. It has no water, it has no atmosphere, it has no volatiles of any kind. So the light elements up to probably about sulfur are not there. None of them. So once you start getting up to that position in the periodic table, none of those volatile elements are in the planet. So where did they come from? And so then they go, oh, well, a comet must have hit Earth. A whole bunch of comets, and they brought the water. Well, when you go out to visit comets, which we have with satellites and gotten close and even landed on one, there's no water, there's no ice, there's no snow. So the argument that somehow, and they still bring this up, you still find people arguing this in popularized journals, etc., that, oh, maybe the snowballs brought the water to Earth. Well, Earth has a lot of water, and it's constantly gaining water every day. We know that from satellite measurements, that the upper atmosphere of Earth is constantly bringing in water and other materials, I might add. So the idea that somehow Earth formed without all of these volatiles and then all of a sudden gained them, but here's the problem. if a comet, let's play devil's advocate let's pretend that the astronomers have something here, and pretend that the comet comes in and hits Earth. Well, the energy of impact, all of that volatile material that would be on the comet, which isn't, would go away. It would just leave Earth, and comets hitting Earth does not account for where water or other volatiles, hydrogen, nitrogen, other gases that are in gaseous form, all of those low atomic mass elements simply are not going to be there. Even if comets hit Earth, even if comets had ice on them, it wouldn't account for Earth having all this water. Okay, so let's take a look at Venus, which is a new planet. It has those volatiles in its atmosphere, and they're in a different form. The hydrocarbons, going all the way up to sulfur, are in gaseous form and liquid form in the atmosphere of Venus. You have sulfur dioxide, you have sulfuric acid, you have hydrogen, oxygen compounds, you have carbon-oxygen compounds, and those were all formed because Venus is a brand new planet. It was formed from a large comet. The ancients saw it, they tell us about it, and that's where the atmospheres come from. And as Venus, as a new planet, as it cools down, it goes through what I call the nuclear stage, which is really hot. That's where it is right now. It's brand new. Then it goes through the chemical stage, and then all of these start cooling down over time, and then water and the other chemicals start to form in a cooler atmosphere. But right now, Venus is so hot that these volatiles just would not exist. You wouldn't have water. You would have water in a super steam state if it were on Venus right now. And so the hydrogen, the oxygen are locked into other more stable chemicals. Okay, so getting back to this, the idea that the solar system formed this way in a swirling dust cloud, it simply doesn't work. It's just fantasy. Now they have to explain the idea of comets. Okay, so here you have hot planets forming, but then you have little supposed ice ball comets forming. And then they say, oh, well, the comets got thrown out of the solar system and ended up in the Oort cloud. Well, this is not how celestial mechanics works. And this is, once again, a flaw of astronomers who don't understand physics. They dropped out of physics probably about 1 to 2 classes and forgot most of it, I'm sure, but never got to celestial mechanics or Newtonian physics, rotational dynamics, things like that. So the idea that Jupiter or one of the planets would throw something out of the solar system and then it would arrive out there and go into a stable orbit is simply not the way things work. If something gets thrown out of the solar system, there are 2 possibilities. Number 1 is that it's thrown out with sufficient velocity that it just never comes back. It's thrown out with more than what is known as escape velocity. So it gets beyond the gravitational pull of the solar system with enough velocity that it just keeps going. The other possibility is that it did not have enough velocity for escaping the solar system, and therefore it comes back. And if it does that, it's not going to nestle into some nice orbit out in the Kuiper belt or in the Oort cloud. It's going to come all the way back to where it came from, in the solar system with where the current planets live. So now none of these standard scenarios work. The real story is that Jupiter and the Sun were the original pair. Now I have a peer-reviewed published paper on this subject. Deals with what is known as continuing galactic formation. That is the title of the paper. And it turns out that the Sun and Jupiter were the original twin star system of our solar system, and there were no other planets at that time. And all of the planets and moons and asteroids, everything that is in the solar system now, was captured at a later date. In fact, this is what I got into a little tussle with when I was at Cornell, is because I was showing that the solar system could not have had more than Jupiter and the sun in the original solar system, and everything else came along by capture, and the planets formed from comets. And of course, this corresponded with the story of Velikovsky, which, by the way, I didn't know at the time. When I was at Cornell in 1979, 81, those years, the Cornell years, I didn't know about Velikovsky. It was only after I left there that a friend of mine, I was explaining to this friend of mine, I was saying, what my theoretical work was, and he goes, well, it sounds like this Velikovsky guy. And so that's the first time I had heard about it, because I had been out of the country. And so the scenario for the formation of the planets is that the Sun and Jupiter come out of this streamer that comes out of the galactic nucleus region. And it's a three-dimensional fluid flow problem where the material comes in a cloud and it comes out the galactic arms, two of them on opposite sides. And my paper talks about conservation of momentum, why there are only two arms on the galaxy, etc. And the end result, however, due to calculations that were made by Russian scientists and mathematicians dealing with celestial mechanics, that when you have this milieu of material forming, typically only two major bodies are a result of this formation. That would have been, and typically one is much bigger than the other one. The only other possibility is that something that appears to be a two-body system, where you have two close together, like the Sun and Jupiter, and then you have another object that's very far away, so that the Sun and Jupiter actually look like one object, gravitationally, an approximation anyway. And so two of them, or you could have two objects orbiting each other, like Jupiter and, say, Saturn, or another third body. But typically those systems are relatively unstable also. But be that as it may, the solar system only began with Jupiter and Saturn, and everything else was captured. Now, the capture process in celestial mechanics requires two celestial objects, which would be the Sun and Jupiter. So what happens is a chunk of material comes around Jupiter, and there's a momentum transfer there. There's an energy transfer, and the new planet coming in loses energy, and Jupiter gains that energy. So what happens then is that new object is trapped into the solar system. It is discharging the solar capacitor because the Sun is now active. In fact, Jupiter would have been very active back in the early days of the solar system. And so the new object is discharging those capacitors, pulling in tail material, and that slows down the orbit and circularizes it. And it's this entire mechanical process, celestial mechanics, of how planets form, how they are captured, how the comets form, and how they nestle into nice circular orbits. And one by one, the planets formed. And the interesting thing here is that this is completely the opposite philosophically from the idea that the solar system formed all at one time at 4.5 billion years ago and nothing has happened since. It's the complete opposite, because new planets are coming in all the time, new moons are coming in all the time, and it's not a daily event, but in historical times, we had a new planet form. It's called Venus. It was Venus the comet. Within the last 10,000 years, it came into the solar system, was captured for the first time, and it had probably been there before. For example, Hale-Bopp is a large comet. It came through the solar system. It left the solar system, came in originally on an orbit of around 4,200 years, and when it left the solar system in the late 1990s, it was on an orbit of 2,600 years. It had lost about 1,700 years were in its orbital period, and it'll come back and it'll lose more and more. That's the tail drag. That's the operative mechanism. The tail drag slows the object down because it's dragging this material into the nucleus as it forms the planet. This is the birthing process of planets. And so this is one of the points. I was talking last week about plate tectonics not being the formation of mountain building. It couldn't. It's absolutely absurd. And I'll get to that in a minute on this bogus formation process that the standard scientific community talks about. But as these new objects come in, and some of them are big, some of them are Jupiter size, so they have a very drastic effect on the planets that are existing. We know that Mars lost its oceans and atmosphere when Venus came by. So these are drastic events. And so these drastic events are fundamental in the process of formation of the planets. And eventually, that's the cause of mountain building on planet Earth. And that just mixes things up. It's a constant mixing. It's a constant change. Nothing is constant. And by the way, this is something too that when you look at the Sagan story, the slow evolution of man and biology, etc., this is not how it happens. In fact, the ink was not even dry on the paper after they buried Velikovsky, that Stephen Jay Gould, one of Sagan's right-hand men in the American Advancement for the American Association for the Advancement of Science meeting in 1974, where they basically buried Velikovsky and destroyed him, called him the crazy old lunatic man, the lunatic fringe, all of these names. The ink was not even dry on the paper when they discovered that, there were radical changes. And so Stephen Jay Gould basically stole Velikovsky's idea that evolution and biological evolution had radical changes that happened very quickly. And so this is a whole history of shenanigans going on and basically stealing material from Velikovsky, better not giving him credit. And so who gets credit for this? Stephen Jay Gould posthumously gets an award for discovering that biological evolution goes in radical steps and then it stabilizes for a period of time, etc. But like I said last week, the idea that asteroids would hit Earth, NASA had to come up with something. And of course, the asteroid hit it excuse is a standard fare. If there's a magnetic field change, an asteroid hit it. If there's a change in the atmosphere, an asteroid hit it. If a comet explodes into brightness, an asteroid hit it. If there was an event on Earth that changed man's history, an asteroid hit it. That's a standard fare. So that's their excuse for everything because, in a sense, you can't disprove it. And so what they're doing is proposing science that cannot be disproven. And that's a bad form of science because science depends on experimentation. Look at the Big Bang, perfect example of science that can never be proven because nobody was there. There's no first-hand experimentation that you can do to prove that the Big Bang even happened or that the solar system formed from this dust cloud. Okay. So now I want to get back to the topic of last week. This is kind of where this is heading. Let us imagine that the Earth formed from this dust cloud. And it formed all at one time. And here you got the Earth, this hot, molten ball of material from sulfur on up, missing all the volatiles from hydrogen, oxygen, all the volatiles up to sulfur are simply missing from this planet. And so there's no atmosphere, there's no oceans, there's no gases of any kind, but you have this liquid, literally liquid molten planet in the form of a sphere. Because why is it in the form of a sphere? Because the gravitational self-gravity of this molten ball of goo forms a sphere, a perfect sphere. And so then what happens, as it cools, there would be plates that form. Just imagine out in the backyard you have a very dry summer, and all of a sudden the ground starts cracking and pulling apart from each other. And that's what would happen on the surface of the planet Earth if it were formed all at one time. And these plates would eventually start pulling away from each other as they cooled. There's no impetus, there's no force, there's nothing to make them coalesce and move one over the other, as they talk about in plate tectonics. So by their own model that the Earth did all this by itself, plate tectonics don't work. Because there's simply no motivation, there's nothing. And remember that I talked about the hammock problem, that if you have a vertical force, to distribute it and make it go sideways 90 degrees to that vertical force simply doesn't work. That force would come up, break through the Earth, the mantle and crust, maybe form volcanoes there, but it wouldn't push these hypothetical plates sideways to form mountains thousands of miles over there or thousands of miles over there. It simply would not work, because the plates, you can imagine, take something like a basketball. Say it's molten and it's under self-gravity and it's cooling. The surface plates would simply move apart, and they would never, ever move back sideways, one on top of the other. It simply wouldn't happen. So plate tectonics, by their own theoretical model, simply does not work. So let me talk about the moon. Now, this is one of the biggest enigmas. Where did the moon come from? Well, they can't explain it, because if the Earth formed and all of this material was conglomerating to form the Earth, then there was the moon would have been part of the Earth. Anything in the neighborhood of Earth would have been part of Earth. That's the entire point. In fact, the whole solar system, most of the planets from Earth on outwards has some moons, especially Jupiter, etc. Where did the moons of Jupiter come from? Anything in the realm of Jupiter would have been part of Jupiter by their cloud coalescing scenario. So how do these moons show up around Saturn? We know that 27 of Saturn's moons are retrograde. So they had to have been captured. They had to have been. There's no other explanation for them. But getting back to Earth's moon, the coalescing story from this dust cloud simply doesn't work. And so what happened is Earth and moon and our moon formed at different times, and they were captured. Now, if you understand how the capture process works, the gravitational exchange, it would have taken a period of time. Let's say that the Earth was here first. It was captured by Jupiter, like everything else, and eventually worked its way into the current orbit where we are now, approximately. But it had no moon. So all of a sudden another object comes into the solar system, it's captured by Jupiter, it starts working its way into the solar system, and all of a sudden it starts encountering Earth. As it's losing energy because of the tail drag, it all of a sudden can be trapped into Earth's gravitational field and eventually becomes a partner with Earth. It could be, this is very interesting, that the moon was here first and the Earth came second. The Earth, the bigger thing, came along after the moon. That's a total valid possibility in the comet capture scenario, which is my work. This is my original work, and it was published in, I was going through this series of publications when I was at Cornell in 1979. I had already had a book talking about the comet capture processes in solar system formation, etc. And so the series of publications were all set. They were all going out to the editors. They were being published in peer-reviewed journals, and all of a sudden, the boys at Cornell, led by Carl Sagan, shut me down because this was against their model where everything formed at one time. But anyway, then eventually my work got published And it ultimately recognized in tier 1 level science, because you have to remember that the visible science at Cornell, even at that time with NASA scientists, etc., was tier 2 science. And because the tier 1 scientists have come out and talked to me, and basically they said, everything you're doing is 100% correct. We know it. And so this battle between tier 2 scientists or tier 3 scientists, these outreach people who are the mouthpieces for NASA, because NASA, remember, doesn't ever say anything. If you ask NASA about anything from the moon landing to space science to anything else, they never say anything. They have these outreach people that do the speaking, the bidding for them, because they never have to say anything. They never have to so-called lie, for example. Okay, so at any rate, the moon and Earth were both captured. They're both captured objects. And let me talk about the scenario that comes from standard science. That the idea that something collided into the Earth, knocked a piece of it off, and that became the moon. Well, that's not the way celestial mechanics works. If something came in and hit Earth and a piece of Earth left Earth, it would go out and it would come back and collide with Earth again. That's the way orbital dynamics works. And so the idea that something hit Earth and created the moon is bogus. It's simply, and there again, you have people who are astronomers, even astrophysicists, who don't understand basic celestial dynamics, celestial mechanics, celestial physics. If something hit Earth and knocked a piece of it off, that piece would go out, it would come back and would rejoin with Earth. So that's not the way the moon formed. It's impossible by that scenario. So they're left with all of the planets with no moons. And the idea that something would come in and hit Jupiter all these different times to create the dozens and dozens of moons of Jupiter or Saturn. And by the way, the Jupiter is primarily gas. And so you're not going to have something come in and hit the inner part of Jupiter, which is primarily, as far as we understand, metallic hydrogen. And it's not going to form the terrestrial moons, the Galilean, the big moons of Jupiter. It's not going to form those. Where did that material come from? Because Jupiter is composed of something completely different. So anyway, every time you peel back another onion layer of standard astronomy, it doesn't make any sense at all. And that's indicative of the fact that they don't think. They don't have basic understanding of physics and of just material science. That's a great example of that. And here's another thing. This dirty snowball comet model is so hilarious because if it worked, then the three moons of Jupiter, Io is a very volcanic moon. It's a new moon of Jupiter, but the other three moons are covered with ice. And they're out in the solar wind, they're in the radiation belts of Jupiter, and they should be the biggest comets you ever saw. They should be ice ball comets. They should have tails that stretch halfway across the solar system, and they don't. It's the dirty snowball comet model doesn't work. Absolutely ridiculous. So we have three objects that should be comets, according to the dirty snowball comet model, should be big comets, and they're not doing anything. They're not comets. They were, by my model, the plasma discharge comet model, they were comets in the solar system and then captured by Jupiter one by one, just like everything else in the solar system. So it makes perfect sense. The idea that they pick up a rock on planet Earth or study the surface within a few feet of the surface, maybe they drill down a little bit or even a kilometer. There are drill holes that have gone down for oil as far as 18 miles into the Earth. And basically, however, if that's nothing, that's really nothing compared to the full diameter of Earth. So there's literally no data that we have regarding the interior of the Earth. There's none. They have absolutely zero experimental evidential material that comes from deep in the earth. So how can they put a date on it of 4.5 billion years? It's laughable. I mean, this is in textbooks, boys and girls. You send your kid to college, pay thousands and thousands of dollars for a science education. This is what they're teaching them? Garbage. You're paying for garbage. That college education, especially science, astronomy, and astrophysics, what they're teaching them is pure garbage. I mean, it's just, I hate to tell you the truth, but that's what it is. Now, when I taught astronomy at the university levels, I told my students, I said, the university requires that I teach out of this book and that I choose a textbook and write a syllabus because you have to teach by the syllabus. But I told the students, and I told them this is all garbage. None of this stuff makes sense. And they were very happy about that. This is in terms that any layman could understand. Okay, so we've talked about the moon. How about this? This is something that you might consider minor, but we have the Great Lakes. We have Lake Vostok, which is under the ice cap in Antarctica, pure freshwater lake, very large. We have the lakes of Central Europe and Russia. And then we have things like the Baltic Sea, the Caspian Sea, the Red Sea, the Dead Sea. And why is it dead? Because there's so much salt in it. You can, if you ever floated in a body of water like that, if you're used to floating in fresh water, you sink almost up to here. You can barely keep your mouth and nose above water. But in the Dead Sea, there's so much salt content that you float much higher. And but anyway, the question from a geological point of view is, where did the salt come from some of these bodies of water? And then you have the Great Lakes that don't have a trace of salt, not a teaspoon full of salt in all of the Great Lakes, pure fresh water. It's because they were under the Laurentian ice cap for who knows how long. We don't know how long the Laurentian ice cap was there. But understand, too, that Earth has had some violent activity at the hand of passing large comet nuclei. So we know, too, I know, that the Earth's atmosphere has changed drastically many times. And this is another assumption that's patently false. When the dinosaurs roamed the Earth, there was a very high carbon dioxide content in Earth's atmosphere, and that's why the material growth, the plant growth on Earth was just everywhere. So it had plenty of water, had carbon dioxide, and the plants grew like crazy. And it was like basically a very vibrant planet. There is not enough. Look at where we find dinosaur bones. Out in the middle of Wyoming. There's not enough scratch on the desert, enough plant material to feed a cow, let alone a dinosaur, let alone a mastodon, where you also find the mastodons there and in many other places. But there's not a single place on planet Earth today, including the Amazon jungle, that would support a dinosaur, let alone a whole herd of them. So the Earth's climate has changed drastically, and it's not because of some guy driving the dinosaurs didn't have SUVs driving up and down the road. Sorry to break the news to you. And the Earth was a very vibrant place at that time. It was probably relatively cool because the plant life absorbs the sunlight and it cools things down. I talked about this a number of weeks ago. The positive feedback aspect of having much more CO2 in the atmosphere. The plants would grow better, there would be more plant life, they would absorb more of the visible spectrum of the sunlight coming in, and it would make it cooler. So you don't want to remove carbon dioxide. What you're doing by removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere is you're killing the planet. You're basically going to get to a point where there's not enough CO2 to support the plant life, and then all the humans will die too. And they're worried about the ocean level rising. No, that has nothing to do with ocean level rising or heating of the atmosphere or melting of glaciers. We're coming out of an ice age. And the initial melt was radical. It flooded. That when the Laurentian ice cap melted, the flooding that went out west, the western, northwestern states that are now Oregon, Washington, the Scablands of Washington, or the Mississippi River Valley, or the Nile River Valley, all of these different places on Earth had been glaciated, and when the pole shift occurred, the melting occurred overnight. It was not because some asteroid hit it. I mean, the clowns are running around the internet today, jumping up and down. I mean, it's just it's funny. It's funny. You have to understand what happened. So let me go through the scenario of actually what did happen recently during the Noah's event and then the Venus event. Now, I have recordings on my 2 CD set. It's 18 hours of lectures, 33 different lectures, 18 full hours MP3 lectures. And a couple of those topics deal with the Noah's flood and the Moses event, or the Venus event. That's what the Mayans called the Quetzalcoatl event, or the Aztecs and the who came later recount that also, or the Incas. The Incas ancestors, the Mayan ancestors were there they were first-hand witness to the Quetzalcoatl, the plumed serpent god of the night sky, Venus, the comet that became the planet Venus. It's in the Popol Vuh. Okay, so anyway, the Noah's flood, which was predicted, that's why Noah built the ark. He knew that this comet was coming, and he knew the earth would be involved in the tail of the comet for a period of time, and so there was going to be a worldwide flood. This was something that was predicted. It wasn't because an asteroid hit Earth or some foolishness. It rained torrential rain. The entire world was blanketed in rain for a period of weeks and weeks, and it just washed everything away. The ocean levels rose, and when the smoke cleared, so to speak, when the final devastation occurred, there was nothing left. If you had something like that happen today, very little would be left. Very little of civilization would be left. And the few people that survived would come back, and they would get out, and they would start rebuilding society from scratch, and that legend would go down. But even today, with all of the modern infrastructure that is there, very, very little of it would survive a Noah's flood type of catastrophe. Okay, now let's talk about the Venus event, where Venus, the comet, came close. First of all, it was captured by Jupiter. It exploded into brightness. It starts working its way through the solar system, losing energy, having its orbit circularized. It eventually passes by Mars. The ancients saw it. They saw it remove the oceans and atmosphere from Mars, leaving the red hulk today. And NASA keeps struggling with this, that, there were oceans, but billions of years ago. No. All of the features of Mars would have been long since eroded away, because Mars has an atmosphere. It's not like the moon that has no atmosphere. In fact, the moon could have had an atmosphere at one time, and it was pulled away by Venus. It's another aspect of our moon, by the way, that its orbit is inclined to Earth's orbit, and that's just another indicator that recently, when in astronomical terms, Earth's moon had a perturbation. Because normally, like I say, if it's above the plane of the planets, Jupiter's pulling down on it. If it's below the plane of the planets, Jupiter's pulling up on it. And so our moon is just an indicator that something drastic happened in the solar system to the Earth-Moon system within recent astronomical time. Just another proof of that. But Venus then worked its way into the solar system in the plane of the planets, encountered Earth on 2 different occasions. The second one was much stronger, and that's where the Moses event, when Moses was leading the Israelites out of Egypt, that's when Remember the pillar of fire leading up into the sky? That was the visible electrical connection with Earth. And the shifting of the Red Sea was a tidal wave. The Mayans actually talk about this too, where Quetzalcoatl, which also refers to Venus, the comet, the oceans would ride up on the back of Quetzalcoatl. And they talked about tsunamis. And so that's what happened at the Red Sea, is the Red Sea sloshed in one direction, and we know where they crossed. There's a small isthmus there where the Israelites crossed. And then when the Pharaoh's armies came in with the chariots, they sloshed back and killed them all. And those chariots are still there in the Red Sea. This is all a very real story. And it happened as Venus, the comet, was coming by Earth, which brings up the topic, a term that I coined, dealing with all of these different effects, called action at a distance. And so action at a distance deals with the fact that all of these different effects affect Earth without, I repeat, without any kind of collision. Without any kind of collision between Venus and Earth. It was just passing by, gravitational, electrical, electromagnetic, and all the different effects, the gravitational, the pollution event. Now, why would Venus extract the oceans and atmosphere from Mars but not Earth? And that's because the surface gravity of Venus was greater than Mars because it was bigger, yet Venus was smaller than Earth, so we had a pollution event. And that was in the chronicles of the event in Egypt, where the Israelites were coming out of Egypt. All of those effects, the red hand of death, the plague of all this vermin that came out of the ground, the locusts, the flies, etc., all of this coming out of the ground was due to the electrical effects of the comet. I told the story about when we were kids, when we wanted to go fishing, we wouldn't go dig up worms. We would take the battery out of the car and we'd put 2 leads down in the ground from the car battery, and within minutes, all these worms would come up out of the ground. We'd throw them in our bucket and go fishing. And so the same thing happened with the electrical effects of Venus passing Earth. All of this stuff came up out of the ground, and they had to deal with it. You know, you wouldn't believe how much stuff is living in the ground. And the electrical effects, for some reason, they don't like that electrical current in the ground, and it drives them out of the ground. Okay, there's a couple topics I want to cover before the end of this show, and one of them has to do with something called foothills. Foothills, when you have a mountain range, you have like the Alps or the Rocky Mountains, you have the Andes mountain range or the Pyrenees, and as you approach them, say you're in a car, you're driving up, all of a sudden you start to get rises in the ground. And it's a lot of times coming off a flat valley plain, perfectly flat for hundreds of miles. And all of a sudden you start getting these low rises, and it drops down. You come up and over the next one, it's a bit bigger. And then all of a sudden it starts forming hills. And a lot of times you'll have a road, for example, that might be cut through one of these, and you get to see the rock layers. Roads are a great place to see geology because they've cut through the geological layers. And you can see that they're contorted and compressed. And that's where the gravitational wave that was coming from this passing large comet nucleus, they start to feel the resistance, so to speak, of that mountain. And they're starting to slow down. And so they're contorting the land, and this wave is coming in. Now, it's very similar. Let's look at an ocean wave. When an ocean wave comes in, it's this long, rolling wave that's coming in, and all of a sudden the coastline underneath is less and less shallow, and so it slows the wave down, the energy in the wave. And so what does the wave do? It starts building up, and then all of a sudden it'll break over as the water gets shallow. And so anyway, and that's why you put a breakwater a lot of times offshore you put a breakwater so that when the wave comes in, it'll break at least once before it comes into shore. And but anyway, with the land wave, which might be 400 or 500 feet tall, or maybe larger, maybe 1,000 feet, maybe 2,000 feet, this wave is coming in. And typically, if you're out in the flat plains, there's nothing to slow that wave down. So it rises up and it comes back down, and it moves along at probably 1,000 to 2,000 miles an hour, because that's the gravitational wave of the object passing by. Okay, so now that wave starts to feel the resistance of the mountains that are already there. And that's where the foothills come in. And then as that wave rears up and crashes into the mountain, all of that energy is absorbed in the current mountain range. And that's why the mountains keep building on the same place. You find if you look at the mountain ranges, and because these come in at different directions, you'll see the mountain building coming in from different directions. If you know what to look for, this is very obvious, and it's very clear that these mountains are not built by plate tectonics. Absolute absurd idea. But okay, so that's a concept that's very important. How that energy comes in and is distributed, and that the wave, the energy that's in the wave, is absorbed by the existing mountain range. And so the mountain ranges have probably, you can say that something like the Alps did not form all at one time. They maybe 20, maybe even up to 30 different epochs where the gravitational waves came in. And that's why the mountains, by the way, always form in the same places when these gravitational events occur. The other thing I want to talk about is to clarify the idea of a pole shift. Now, I have one of my books. It's called The Surviving Planet X Passage, and in there I have diagrams of how the surface of the Earth is shifted. Now, the Earth is made, it's kind of like a soft-boiled egg, where the surface of the egg shell and the inside are not really connected. So do this. Take a soft or uncooked egg, spin it on a table, and it'll stop almost immediately. Do that. Take an egg, just a raw egg, spin it on a table, and it'll stop. Take a hard-boiled egg, spin it on a table, it keeps spinning. Why? Because the shell and the inner part are connected. They're physically connected because the egg is hard-boiled. Okay, so the soft-boiled egg is like Earth, where the shell and the mantle are not really connected to the internal part. So if you shift the mantle and the crust of Earth over the internal part is going to continue spinning in the same direction that it was spinning in before. Okay, so but the shell will slide over it. And that's why we have volcanoes. By the way, with the original story where the Earth formed all at one time from this dust cloud, you wouldn't have volcanoes 4.5 billion years later. The reason Earth is as geologically active as it is today is because of the pole shift that happened within the last 5,000 years during the Venus event. And when that happens, what happened was what we call the Laurentian ice cap was the old North Pole. And when it shifted, it melted, like right now. It melted very quickly, and it flooded out. There's massive flood regions in the United States especially, and you'll notice that the Laurentian ice cap never went down into what we call Siberia. There was a pole shift, a physical pole shift. This is not a magnetic pole shift. It is a physical pole shift, and I make this very clear in my discussion in the Surviving Planet X Passage book. And I just want to remind you that the sponsor this week is JMCC Water Filters, webpage, jmccwaterfilters.com. There are replacement filter elements for gravity water filters. Flagship product of the company is the MR5 whole house water filter. Unlike anything you will find, stainless steel construction and 5 large filter elements that remove toxins, etc. from your water. So go to the webpage, jmccwaterfilters.com, and use the coupon code MASTER for a 10% discount.
This has been Master of Science with host James McCanney. Join us each week as James will delve into historical figures such as Nikola Tesla, Albert Einstein, and the great mathematicians as we explore the history of man, Earth, and our universe as you've never seen it before. Tuesdays, 7 p.m. Eastern, right here on the Bold Brave TV network, powered by B2 Studios.